I think there's a reason that our system works so well. You and I were both SMEs on one of our early exams. I think that eating our own dog food was really helpful. Like we went through the process. We saw the reviews. We saw what people, we wrote the items. We saw, the whole process from the inside. I think that was really helpful.
Yes.
And I enjoyed doing it too.
No, it was a lot of fun. Hello, my name is Ruben Garcia, CEO and co-founder of Certiverse, and welcome to Valid Questions. If you don't know what Certiverse does, we are a technology, a platform, and the whole point of Certiverse is really to help design and launch exams very quickly, and obviously do it with all the psychometrics behind it. So that's what we do, and I'm really happy today because today we have co-founder, psychometrician, Dr. Alan Mead. Dr. Alan Mead has a lot of experience. He's been doing psychometrics for a long time, and I'd love to. I want to just chat with Dr. Alan Mead. And can I just call you Alan? Is that all right?
Yes. Yes.
But so Alan, yeah. So I'd love to for you to just have a conversation around psychometrics. Obviously, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your background. And also, I'll tell a little small story about how I met you and how I managed to convince you to come and join Certiverse.
So my name is Alan Mead, and I'm just Alan. I had forgotten that I was a doctor until Ruben reminded me. Although I thought of my dissertation recently, but all my friends are doctors, so it's not a mark of distinction. And I am an experienced psychometrician. I'm actually trained as an IO psychologist. When I was in I originally went to college to be an engineer, and I didn't want to do that. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I decided that I wanted to be either a psychometrician or an industrial psychologist. And I became both. And so I've had experience both doing development for selection test programs and for certification test programs. Some of my work has been relatively typical, but I've also done quite a few unusual things like developing, advanced CAT engines for, advanced IRT models that create paired comparison personality tests and things like that. So I enjoy those challenges. And I also taught on the faculty at IIT for a while. In fact, I guess technically I'm not on the faculty, but as an adjunct, I'm teaching psychometrics this semester. I enjoy teaching that. I enjoy teaching that class especially. I teach some other classes as well. So, my dissertation was about a methodology that machine learning theorists use for doing cross-validation. I didn't realize that it was called leave one out cross-validation when I started my dissertation, but that's what it was. And I applied it to a methodology that IO psychologists use to produce keys for tests that don't have correct keys. Like if the question is, how many jobs have you had in the past 5 years? That question has no correct answer, but we can use empirical data to key that question. So that was my dissertation, and I have done work in areas that might be called machine learning or natural language processing for quite a while. I think that blending those methods into standard analytics is pretty natural, and most people should be doing it. So that's I think a lot of psychometricians these days are seeing it that way. So that's the sort of psychometrics that I typically do.
Very cool. So, I'll tell you, the kind of like the story of how we met, because it's a little bit interesting, and, I didn't know who you were. But, I had, I had the idea of and concept of Certiverse. I kind of like thought, we're solving the problem around getting exams close, taking the exams closer to the candidates, right? So people that are need to get certified or need to take some sort of exam, eliminating the test center and the travel and the cost and all that stuff, with remote proctoring, that obviously solved that. And then, I was kind of up for a challenge, and I did a little bit of analysis. And I'm like, the content side is an area that really needs disruption and modernizing. I would say, there's just, as you kind of like look at it, it's a very legacy model, right? And I didn't really understand content that much. I didn't understand exam development, all the things that go into the process to develop an exam. I just knew that I felt like that the exam development process or the certification process, that there was something there that needed to be improved. Just based on like, how size the club is in regards to like the number of companies that are out there, organizations that are creating exams, right? It seems it must be expensive if there's only a few organizations that are doing it. Anyway, so my idea was around, can we use modern technologies, modern, models like crowdsourcing and so forth to go and develop these exams. So I had a conversation with a dear friend who, will go unmentioned. And I was explaining to him, who's a psychometrician. I said to him, like, this is what I want to do. What do you think about this? And he said, like, oh my God, I have like the perfect person that you should talk to. And, obviously said, do you know Dr. Alan Mead? I'm like, no. And send me a couple of your documents. And I remember seeing one of your, I think it was a presentation that you did around, there was some NLP, natural language processing algorithm. And I thought it was very interesting. Obviously, we met, and we met at Manny's, I think, the great deli
with the world's best corned beef.
Yeah, and we talked, and I like took out my laptop, and I'm like, hey, this is the idea. It's the idea is we want to design exams, and we want to use subject matter experts. We want to use the crowd. And
you showed me a demo. I
showed you a demo of it, and then I said, this is how we're thinking about it. And I remember you looking at this, and you're like, oh, this is a great idea, except none of it will work.
I think I was more diplomatic than that, but
you're like, this is a great idea, but none of it is psychometrically valid. Like, good luck building this. But I mean, like, I think that over that lunch, and like obviously you grasped my enthusiasm for how much I wanted to kind of, really, I really wanted to build this.
We still write exams today in 2022. I mean, not Certiverse necessarily, but the industry, the same way that they wrote them in 1922. I mean, we use word processors instead of or sometimes there are platforms, but we write atoms in the same way. And when I was a faculty member and I was looking at what you're supposed to pick out areas of interest, and I was sort of interested in technology and interested in psychometrics, and I realized that if you look at all of the psychometric literature and its voluminous, there's a huge stack of reports. It would kill you if it fell over on you. It's all about, or almost all about, what you do after you've gathered a lot of data. And after you've gathered a lot of data is when the items are all written. The exam is put together. It's been, placed in front of 200 or 300 examinees. So it's all about what you do after you've written the exam. There's almost nothing about what you do. There's been some research, but the amount of research that's been spent on the part about creating the exam is much, much smaller than the part about what you do with the data that you get from the exam. And I saw it as an opportunity, and I started applying natural language processing and machine learning to the process with the idea that you could do the kind of rigorous analyses we do with data, with the data that come from the responses. You could do that same analysis with the items, with the words of the items. So I think that's exciting, and the idea of applying more rigor to the item writing process and helping item writers write items more efficiently is one of the areas that I'm most excited about. I think that.
So I think that the approach that we're obviously applying technology a lot of different technologies along the process, at every step of the way, and I think that what people don't realize, I think, is, and I'm actually, a lot of people do realize this, because they're tasked with launching a certification exam, and what they realize is that it's a very human driven process, right? And it requires knowledge from subject matter experts, right? And which we in the industry call SMEs, but requires knowledge from SMEs. And then there's all these like junction points where these SMEs have to come in and collaborate and provide their knowledge, and also like you also have to like train them in the art of testing. So that like as I kind of looked at all these junction points, I would say, where you're developing this, you need SMEs, and you have to train them, and you have to teach them about why they're doing this, right? To make the process work and so forth. And that was, I think, one of the hardest things that we know, as we talked about crowdsourcing, because there's so many people out there with knowledge, but how do you make it efficient to bring somebody in and get them through the process without having to like make them experts in training? But yeah, let's just start, if you don't mind. Can you give us, like, at a high level, what's the process for developing exams? So like, we have, from start to the, here's a form that an actual test taker is going to take? Where do we start at the beginning?
So you have to start with some way of defining the content of the exam, and usually that is part of a document called a blueprint. The blueprint would, for example, list all the specific areas that you want to write items. It would typically have a weight. You want 10% in this area, 5% in that area, 20% in that area. It might also include other things, like if you have innovative item types, it might, or cases, it'll say, okay, you have to have at least one case. It could be fairly detailed or fairly like an outline. And you have to get to that point. So there are different ways of getting to that point. If you have a curriculum, and this exam is designed to measure learning from that curriculum, then it's probably natural to have the curriculum, define that. If you're interested in whether or not a person has skills to perform a role or a specific job, then you probably use something more like job role analysis, like a job task analysis or a skills-based analysis. Or a knowledge analysis to understand what the areas are. So you do a process of job analysis, or you have some other process for telling you, what the areas are. You achieve a blueprint for the exam. Then that blueprint leads directly to item writing. You have to recruit. You've already recruited subject matter experts to either create your curriculum or to help you with the job task analysis. A typical job task analysis would have a group of SMEs come together to write statements that are tasks, like a psychometrician analyzes data, a psychometrician explains data, they write reports. So you'd list a bunch of tasks that a person does, and then you would assemble that onto a JTA survey, and you would rate the importance of those things, and the output of that survey would be a list of tasks, and you'd know which ones are most important and which ones are less important. And the most important ones you would typically then have another meeting with the SMEs to cluster into the domains. Like, okay, well, this one talks about writing a report, that one talks about doing research, this one talks about teaching and adjuncts, so those are academic and research areas, and this one talks about data analysis, and these talk about data analysis, and that's going to be data analysis. And you create the blueprint that way, or again, from a curriculum. But either way, subject matter experts have gotten you to that point. And one of the things that I think is interesting about a blueprint is I tell people that a valid blueprint is a blueprint that you show to stakeholders, subject matter experts, and that they agree makes sense. It's not always, there's judgment involved about how to put it together. So it's not always exactly the way they would do it. But as an example of where, that might fail, we had a project once where the subject matter expert looked at it and said, well, this is all good, but I don't see ethics here. Yeah. And so we added another, bullet for ethics. We could have alternatively added ethics, statements to several different places, but that's the sort of thing that.
So it's a little bit of like science and art, right? Because I feel like, there's empirical data, right? That you have tasks, and then we talked about knowledge areas and domains, or things you're grouping those tasks into areas, and then you're surveying that data, and then you're getting back empirical information about people are saying this is important, this is not that important, but then that's what drives the weight on the blueprint, right?
And the importance of that process is that you have a process. If you just sat down and said, well, we think that we should do this and this, then you might end up with an exam that's very unfair. And so you have a process that you can document and that you can communicate to stakeholders that shows the why you should expect the exam to be fair and to cover all of the points. That's actually quite important, that you be able to defend the content of the exam, because if you don't sort of get started in the right direction, you won't end up with a defensible exam. And that's oftentimes for certification exams, the explanation that the tasks, that the domains are relevant is the main source of validity information.
So let me ask you, let's talk about this. Cause I there's always like pre-COVID and post-COVID models for doing things, right? And we were thinking about this obviously pre-COVID. We were thinking about how do we make this better? Like the biggest thing that I thought that was super key was I felt like there was like a community out there, and there's like, and the model of like, community and crowdsourcing and, all of that stuff together. People around the world writing snippets of code or contributing to a big code project, that eventually powers the world's, internet,
Right.
the
My
Linux
phone.
kernel, your phone, everything, right? So like that's kind of like the model that we were thinking about. And obviously, in order to make that model work, in order, to allow somebody somebody who's got expertise that lives in Egypt, to participate in, an exam that's being developed out of the United States, the best way to bring them in is to design something that doesn't require them to be here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an asynchronous model. We call it asynchronous, right? Where people can add a little bit of code or whatever. Today, so I would like for you to like just again briefly talk about I'm going to call it the legacy way for developing, let's say, a job task analysis and get into the blueprint. Like what's, I know like face to face versus Zoom, but let's give us an overview of how like that process typically worked.
There's a wide variety of practices, and sometimes programs do things in person because they have to, and sometimes they do them in person because they want to. They can corral these experts. If the experts are like, some psychometricians or neurosurgeons or somebody that maybe their time is hard to get, you might corner them at a conference where they're going to be anyhow. And but that's also difficult because then you're taking away from whatever conference activities. But we did design the system before we had ever heard, or I'd ever heard the words COVID.
Yeah.
And it is true that we've had international expertise that we've been able to tap because of our system. But I could envision, somebody whose SMEs are all here in Chicago, and they might still, want to use a remote platform to, collaborate.
But tell us about the process. So like, what's the process for, like, let's just say you start, let's say you're designing the blueprint based on a job task analysis, right? Typically what happens, you're inviting subject matter experts, right? You're saying it's back in the day before COVID, before, everything was done online through Zoom, you typically get them into a room, into a facility, right? And have like a job task analysis workshop, right?
So yes, you would, there were a variety of practices, and sometimes, they would circulate documents, but it was common to get a subject matter experts into a room, or one to seed a list and to develop this list of tasks. It was also common to have dictionaries of tasks, and a job analyst would start by going through that and listing it, and then there were a variety of practices. But I guess the thing that I remember is that they're all very much, one person processes one document, a group gets together and looks at a document, and the person who's facilitating the group has to leave with a set of edits, and they have to make those edits, and things can sit on somebody's desk for a while they get around to doing things. And there was a lot of, handoffs, but there was a variety of practices. But I don't think that I've ever heard of a job analysis system that sort of, you logged in and you listed the tasks, and then somebody automatically, put them onto a survey, and that was all separate steps. And we forget how much effort it is to create a survey. Like, even if the tool is friendly, it's a fair amount of effort to create a survey.
So just to kind of like to summarize what you're saying. So we start off with getting a bunch of tasks, right? And there may be some grouping around taking these tasks and putting them into groups so you can organize them.
We ask people to tag them with domains, and we use that grouping later to create the initial draft of the blueprint. Okay. So I think that's a clever innovation, actually.
And then now you have, again, I'm just talking about traditional models, right? The legacy model. You're still collecting all this data, and then you have your SMEs, and you kind of send them off, and you're like, thank you very much. We got the tasks. We've gotten some groupings. They fly home, they fly back home, or they hang up after being 8 hours in a Zoom meeting. And then after that data has to be compiled into a survey, right? So talk a little bit about what's the importance of the survey.
So the survey gives you a large sample of people, of subject matter experts. By the way, when we said crowdsourcing earlier, Ruben also made reference to the Linux kernel, and there are hundreds of contributors to the Linux kernel, but they're all experts at Linux. Nobody adds anything to the kernel without being an expert, and in fact having other experts review their work. And that's sort of the model that we should be thinking about. Like when we say crowds, crowds of experts.
Yeah.
So you want a crowd of experts to take this JTA survey and to tell you, that way you're not working off the feelings of a handful of subject matter experts who gave you the tasks. You have a relatively large sample. It might be a few dozen. It might be 100. There are professional groups that survey many hundreds of people, and they tell you how important the tasks are, and that helps you to if a task is more important, or let's say that you have identified a group of tasks that are related for a psychometrician as data analysis. So that data analysis is going to be a line item in the blueprint, and if those tasks are rated as quite important, that should have more weight. Yeah. So that's the basic model.
All right. So now you have the weights. You kind of have you have the structure basically for a blueprint, right? And then what's kind of the professional service behind that? Again, legacy model. What are we, is it a psychometrician? Is it a facilitator? Is it a subject matter expert that's then taking that data and trying to, compile it, put it together into a blueprint, putting together objectives? Like, talk a little bit about that piece.
Well, so they're usually exam development staff. They probably work with psychometricians. They might be psychometricians, and they're going to, gather that information. They'll have to analyze the survey. They'll have to export the data. The psychometricians probably will export the data, analyze it. They'll meet with the test development staff. They'll have to have another meeting with SMEs to group the important tasks. Mm-hmm. And then the test development staff will draft a blueprint, and then typically there's stakeholders that approve the blueprint, so they'll present it to those stakeholders, and those stakeholders will either approve it or they'll say something like, "Where's the ethics?" and you'll have to go back and add it.
Exactly. So the legacy model there's a lot of human input, a lot of combining of lists, reviewing, and then one of the things that I found throughout the whole entire process is that there's the data that you have to compile and move in and out of systems, and then take it and put it into a SurveyMonkey, and then take that data. A lot of organizations say, "Well, we use Qualtrics," and we or Qualis, or is it Qualtrics? It's we have to take 3,000 survey records, and then we have to bring it in and put it into SPSS or put it into some tool that can handle all that data and do the analysis. And then it's pretty incredible, all the effort that it takes to get all this done. So when you go online and you're like, I'm gonna go and become a Linux certified associate, and you see a really pretty blueprint with the root topics and then the subtopics and and percents. A lot of work went into get that done.
That's true.
People, I don't think people realize that, but it's very expensive. We'll talk a little bit about the difference, but let's talk about just quickly about item writing process. What's the legacy model? I think the term that the industry uses is item writing workshops, but what happens there?
There are a variety of practices with regard to how you write items, and item writing workshops are a common theme because you need to bring the subject matter experts together and provide training. Typically, you've selected these people because they're experts, but they're experts at Linux or handling food safely or whatever the topic of your exam is. They're not necessarily experts. They probably don't have much expertise at writing items. Yeah. And they'll typically fall into poor practices, not universally, but they will not realize that there are things they shouldn't do. And so the purpose of the training is to give them best practices and things to avoid for the most part.
So there's a lot of training involved in just getting subject matter experts to understand how to write an item and the quality of an item and the rules around writing an item and so forth.
And the we have a little bit of research. For example, wording an item negatively is more likely to make the item harder. It's more likely to make the item less clear. It's especially true, but not exclusively true, if there's a not also in the responses. At that point, it becomes like a logic question. But that's just one example. There's a lot of little rules that we have that we've gleaned from practice, mostly in an educational setting, but I think they mostly apply to any knowledge-based exam. Yeah. And we encourage the SMEs to use those rules. And the consequence is that you have to have this step where you teach them those rules, which is typically, at least half a day or a day, and sometimes it's 2 or 3 days of training.
I mean, I when I worked at Pearson View, I used to share office space with the the nursing program. So the National
NCLEX?
Council of State Boards of Nursing. I think back then Pearson had a contract for developing these exams before. I think the nurses do it themselves now, but I remember, like the very expensive conference room, and they would fly these, subject matter experts in, nurses, who'd take time off of work to come in and help develop write items for these exams.
And probably you paid them for that,
And I remember obviously like the first couple of days was mostly just training them. They'd had like facilitator, they had psychometricians there. We would have people flying in from other cities, headquarters in Bloomington would come, people would come in just to do the training, just to get everybody kind of synced up so that they understand what writing an item is. And then after that, then they can start providing knowledge.
Because not only is item writing a skill that the SMEs don't naturally have because they're experts in an area but not in item writing, but your exam will be, the quality of your exam will be determined by how well they do the item writing task. If they do a poor job and they write a bunch of items that are confusing, then at least the best case scenario is that you then have editors who can fix that at some cost and time and effort. But the worst case scenario is that confusing questions get onto the exam and the exam has lower quality. So that step is critically important. Yeah. And you mentioned an item writing workshop. Not only is it hugely resource intensive to actually have the workshop, but then you're preparing for it. You've got to do things afterward. You've got to edit the items. There's a lot of it's a very hands-on process.
It really is. And then, so let's talk about, weeks and months go by, and finally you have a big database item bank of items. What happens then? What's the next? I know it's different for different exams, but then like what's the process for getting that exam built and getting into the market?
The best practice would be to then beta test those items. So to the simplest beta test would be to select items for a longer form and to administer that longer form to a set of candidates who you've recruited to specifically take a longer form. Typically the score they'll get a pass-fail decision. So it's a real test for them, but they know that you're trying out the items. Yep. They know that there's a delay in reporting. Sometimes you're not able to do that. Regulatory environments, for example, often don't feel like they can do that. So
you're building forms basically, right? And obviously like I've seen you build forms, and it's not something that I can do. Right, I couldn't go and just say, I'm going to go ahead and build a beta form without.
I could teach you to build a beta form if you understood the subject matter.
Potentially, right? But then let's talk about just the subsequent process to that. After you have your beta, you have statistics, and you know how the items are performing. Building operational forms, can I build those?
Yeah, maybe.
It's a joke. I know I can't. But
I'll be honest with you. Every exam program tends to have a psychometrics team that takes that beta exam data and analyzes it and has a list of the items that they would prefer not to use.
Yep.
And they have a team of subject matter experts. And those two teams together, but more the subject matter experts than the psychometricians, are the ones who create the exam because they're the subject matter experts. But the psychometricians are standing in the wings saying, don't use that item. That item, had really bad statistics. And the subject matter expert then usually looks up the item and says, nope, that's the correct answer, and then you have more discussion about it.
I kind of joke about it, but you know what? I know that, I've worked for testing companies all my life, right? And there's teams of people that are developing exams. Worked at Promisor, and Dr. Betty Brickstrom was running psychometrics there. She had like a team of psychometricians, and she had a team of test developers and test builders. And it's a really complicated process. There's a lot of, math and science, and, talk about statistics, and fairness, and, taking two exam forms and then making sure that they're equated so that one is not more difficult. I mean, there is a lot of complexity in that whole entire process.
But ultimately you're creating a written document, but you're doing it to specifications. So there's a element that's like, math and statistics, and there's an element that's like art. And that's why I think the subject matter experts primarily drive it, because they're the keepers of the art, and the psychometricians are the ones, they almost have a job like auditing. They ensure that that the worst items are avoided, or that if at all possible, you don't use an item where there's a better alternative, and then they evaluate the overall form to make sure that overall it's reliable and valid.
Yeah, and then the last piece of it, I think that again, it's there's a bit of a there's a continuous development of that process as well. So like, it's not just, the exam's done and that's it, right? There's continuous analysis of the exam, making sure it's performing, that the forms are performing, the items are performing correctly, and if you need more content and so forth. But it does continue, right? The process continues on, and it's like a never ending process.
It definitely should. I mean, you should continue to write that exam. You might write a smaller quantity of it. It all depends on, how often you want to refresh the exam. But if you leave the same exam form in the field forever, it probably will not remain secure. And so you have to decide how often you want to refresh it. And the typical way that you do that is by not introducing a brand new form, but by writing items. And it's sometimes called seeding. You take some pre-tested items and you drop them into the exam, and you administer them as if they were, without marking them as unscored, but they're not scored on that exam. You're gathering data, and then a psychometrician would analyze that data, would ultimately decide that the item was acceptable, and it would go into a pool, or it was unacceptable. Maybe they rewrite it and try again. But once you build that pool, then you can create additional forms.
Yep. So anyways, like the end to end, very complicated process, when you're designing the exam, building it, getting the blueprint, getting, training folks to subject matter experts to come in and write items, and then taking all those items, trying to, build beta tests, and then taking that beta data and then creating, operational forms. It's a very complicated process. And, and I would say that I was very surprised by it, because I primarily focus on the delivery side, and the security around, wrapping security around delivering exams. But I was very, I was completely didn't expect how much work is involved. So, working with you on building out Certiverse has been, it's been a challenge, but I think, I've been loving the work, because it's, I'm learning a lot of things along the way. But let's talk about just kind of the Certiverse model, right? Because I think that we've taken a very different approach, because, our goal with Certiverse is really to help organizations to get that certification out there, right? That exam that's going to allow somebody to, to get certified. Yep. And change somebody's life, whether it's a job or a new career path, or validating their skills or promotion, that's critical, right? And I keep saying this, but I think that there's the exam development club, it's a very small club. And I think it's mostly because of the cost and the time that it takes to get these certifications and these exams out there. So that's been our goal, is to address the cost and time. But job task analysis is an example. I think you've invented some really cool technologies in regards to, using natural language processing, and then we did a lot of work around, like we talked about data and, building things to the system so you don't have to export stuff and things like that.
Let me agree and disagree with you. The traditional model of creating exams is very subject matter expert intensive, SME intensive. You need a lot of input from subject matter experts. And the Certiverse model doesn't change that. We still need subject matter experts. In fact, that aspect is exactly the same. But we provide a platform that's more efficient for them. And we try and take each of the phases and help them be more efficient. And so, one of the things you alluded to is during the task elicitation phase of JTA, there's a set of coaching prompts that come up as the subject matter experts write the tasks. It encourages them to start with an action verb, and we can actually tell if a word is an action word or not, and encourages them not to make it too short or too long. And so some simple coaching there. And then during item writing, we have similar coaching for the item writers to write items, keep the option length similar, avoid negated items, and so on and so forth. Phrase your question as a question. And so we have these rules that we enforce. I wish that like one of the things I'm excited about is pushing that further. But I think that coaching in the moment is quite important to getting a good result. I think otherwise, the way that it would work traditionally is that the SME would write whatever they write, and then a psychometrician or a test developer or an editor would look at it and they'd say, oh, that shouldn't be that way, or there's a problem. And then it has to go back to the SME author. So if you catch them right as they do it, it's just like using Word and seeing that you've misspelled a word, instead of sending it off to somebody else to spell check and then asking you what word you wanted. It just asks, it just prompts you to fix the mistake, or you might know that it's not a mistake. So the subject matter expert is empowered to create better items, better tasks in the GTA, and better items in the item writing.
And I think the real time feedback is critical to the to that model, right? Like letting them know that, it's a double negative, or that, they're just even simple things, that have been implemented where, as an example, like, some of the mistakes that SMEs make is, they'll write the STEM, the question, and then they'll write their correct answer. And then they kind of get, they've been writing a lot of items or whatever. And they kind of, they do things like, I'm just going to put all of the above,
right.
or, for my last response, or they, they just get tired of, like, as you're writing the response options, they'll say, this is the correct answer. And then their incorrect answers will be much longer or much shorter. And then,
which would give it away.
Right. So the system basically, is coaching them in real time, saying, your correct answer is too long, or it's too short, or it's not the same length as your incorrect answers. So some of that stuff, it's pretty incredible, right? Because like the asynchronous piece of it is, we definitely, I think we still have a lot of work to do, but definitely have solved the problem where we don't have to have people, come into a workshop, and we can bring in people from around the world to help contribute to an exam.
And I think that coaching is more effective than giving them a whole day presentation. I think that, teaching them the rules and expecting them to remember there are 43 rules that are typically used. Expecting them to remember 43 rules and apply them is unrealistic. But having the system automatically, check for common problems and coach them how to solve them is, I think, much more effective. There's a limited number that we can realistically enforce in the moment. And the next step is that they submit it into a review queue, and then a peer would review the items. We require, by default, 2 peer reviews to pass the item. And the peers would enforce other rules, like, is the item biased? Is the item clear? Is it on topic? Is the correct answer actually correct?
Yep.
So I think that's important. I think that those steps that not only make it easier to write items, but I think it ensures that the items that get written are of a higher quality than we would otherwise get. So I don't have data to tell you how much better, but I know that that's a good process that is more efficient and probably produces better results than the typical.
Yeah, I mean,
approach.
I know we're seeing it with the customers that are using our platform, right? Because they tell us, they're like, they've done the legacy model, and also just the number of exams that they're launching with our platform. Customers that typically would only be able to launch 2 exams a year because of the budget, because you have all those, professional services, psychometrics, et cetera, facilitators. And
we certainly have data that it can be very efficient. We also have data that suggests that a large proportion of the items are at least acceptable quality. And I think probably a larger proportion are better items than would typically be the case. There's always a small number, though, that are caught by the beta tests that aren't.
Yeah, but it's pretty incredible, the numbers that we're seeing, right? Like 90% plus, high quality, or
92%.
92%. There you go. That's what happens when you have a psychometrician. They give you the exact number. But yeah, the number of high quality items is pretty incredible. And then, one of the things that I thought was kind of, I don't know who within the company thought about it, but the review process of having, as soon as you submit an item, it goes to another subject matter expert, and they will, we made the review process really easy, so you can like review on your phone or whatever if you want, or on, very quickly. It's
5 minutes usually.
5 minutes, yes, no questions. But that, giving that original author instant feedback, of their item is pretty incredible, right? Because if they made a small mistake in the item, or whatever it is,
they
right?
didn't think about how somebody would read something.
They would, yeah, and they get that instantly. And like it's a little bit like writing code, because like we talk about this when we're as we were building the platform and doing sprints and stuff like that. And one of the things that the developers love is that if you find a bug, with their thing, or if you want to change, they want to change it right away.
Yeah.
Because their mind is.
Yeah.
Where they've been working on that piece of code and that UI or whatever, and they want to be able to change it right away. And that's part of the process that makes it quick as well.
If you get feedback, it's not always instantaneous because it depends on a reviewer doing it. But if you get feedback the next day, the item's still fresh in your mind. If you get feedback, a month later,
it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's been one of the interesting things as we see, our clients start using Certiverse, and then write items, and then all of a sudden, like, they'll have their whole entire item bank. But But I think that like, I know we're still continuing to build out a lot of more async features and
I think there's a reason that our system works so well. You and I were both SMEs on one of our early exams. I think that eating our own dog food was really helpful. Like we went through the process. We saw the reviews. We saw what people, we wrote the items. We saw, the whole process from the inside. I think that was really helpful.
Yes.
And I enjoyed doing it too.
No, it was a lot of fun, like being, writing a couple of items for that exam, and applying some of my knowledge and some of the, open source technologies and stuff like that. No, it was very impactful because you're like, but at the same time you realize like, as we did the job task analysis, and I got to participate in that for one of the exams, and then the item writing as well in the review, but it's a lot of work. And it was pretty incredible seeing some of that, some of the technology and work. And obviously it wasn't perfect the first time, that was the first exam. We've added a lot more technology and, we've implemented a lot of things. One of the things that I would say is really interesting that was, that the product team has implemented is this concept of like where an item writer will submit items. I mean, they might be very knowledgeable, but they might not be like the best item writer or, fully grasp the concept of writing items, right? Where we can detect like that they're eating a lot of review cycles, and then we can start saying, okay, you know what, like maybe item writing is not for you, right? And start kind of like taking them down a different path.
Although that said, I think that a lot of people are interested in SME metrics. How well is this SME performing? But I think that I look at it a little differently. I mean, SME metrics would be very interesting, but the only recourse you have at that point is like putting the SME aside and talking to them virtually or in real life. I think the more effective way to make that a moot point is to have the system make it very easy for people who are cooperating or who are expert in the area and who are interested in doing it. And I think that's, where we're going. I don't think you need to manage the SMEs because the SMEs are just, they're doing it, they're doing the reviews, and, the approved items are just piling up.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
That's how most projects go.
It's been great kind of like launching this and seeing all this come together. And then, adding, so just, we have a few more minutes, but I would love for you to talk about, because I think that we've done a great job solving the blueprint design model, right? And I know we're still building more things and we're still making it better, but the asynchronous model where we can get SMEs to participate and help design exams, I think that we've done an amazing job there. Item writing as well. We have now thousands of items that have been written in Certiverse, and thousands and thousands of reviews of those items, right? It's been pretty incredible to see the platform grow. But let's talk about just really quick about what we're doing on the test assembly side, because I think that's also very manual process, right? We talked about the beta and stuff like that and how you select items, but I also feel like that's also very expensive professional services.
Subject matter experts, some of them may prefer to practice the art of putting a form together themselves, and they'll always be able to do that. But if the form has to conform to a blueprint, we can save a fair amount of effort by selecting items that avoid item enemies, that avoid the items that have statistics suggest that you want to avoid them, and create and more or less choose at random from amongst the items that are remaining, and build out a form and then show that to the subject matter expert. And they can start with a created form and they can say, oh, this is great. Or wait a minute, I didn't want, 5 items about the color purple. And so, let's take 2 of those off and we'll find other items for that. So I think that the process technically is called automated test assembly, ATA, but I don't think we're going to emphasize that because the number of people who know what ATA is in the world is pretty small. And those people are probably used to doing something pretty complex, like, setting up the optimization problem and then running an optimizer to optimize it. And this won't bear any resemblance to that. It'll just create forms. My vision was that you would press a button and a form would pop up and you would get to then approve it or, decide that it needs some work, and you'd be able to make some quick changes to it. That's close to what we'll be able to, do.
It's still, I think it's a big advancement.
I think it'll be helpful for a lot of people. And I think that even if you want to have a lot of hands-on, you'll still, the SMEs will still be in charge of approving those forms at the end. So
cool. All right. So, there's so much more to talk about. I know our time is limited, but, I want to thank you obviously for being on here, but if somebody has any questions about psychometrics or, NLP or, some of the other research projects that you're working, I know you submitted some research projects.
Yeah, we just had a paper accepted on predicting Bloom's taxonomy using machine learning.
That's pretty incredible. So, where can people reach you, Alan?
So they can send me an email, alan@certiverse.com.
All right. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you.
And
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Hopefully we can do a second episode on some of the other things that you're implementing.
I would love to do that.
All right.
Thanks, Ruben.